The humid air hit me like a wall as I stepped off the plane at Tan Son Nhat Airport in Ho Chi Minh City. My hands were shaking as I clutched the worn photograph in my pocket, a picture of a 12-year-old Vietnamese boy with bright eyes and a gentle smile. After 40 years, I was finally back in Vietnam, back to honor a promise I should have kept decades ago. The sounds around me were overwhelming. Vietnamese voices echoed through the terminal, mixing with the hum of air conditioning and the shuffle of thousands of feet. The smell of pho and lemongrass drifted from a nearby restaurant, and for a moment I was transported back to 1971, back to the jungle, back to the war that changed everything. I'm 68 years old now, and I've spent most of my adult life trying to forget Vietnam. But some memories refuse to fade. Some promises refuse to let you go. As I walked through customs, my heart was pounding so hard, I thought the officers might hear it. What was I doing here? What if I couldn't find what I was looking for? What if it was too late? The photograph in my pocket was creased and faded, but I could still make out every detail of that young face. Duc Nguyen, the boy who saved my life when I was just 24 years old, wounded and lost in a jungle that wanted to kill me. The boy I promised to come back for. The boy I abandoned. I almost turned around right there in the airport. My legs felt weak and my chest was tight with anxiety. 40 years is a long time. People move, people die, families scatter like leaves in the wind. What were the chances that anyone who knew Duc was still alive? What were the chances that anyone would even remember him? But then I heard his voice in my memory, speaking in broken English mixed with Vietnamese. "You come back, Joe? You promise you come back?" And I had promised. God help me. I had looked that brave little boy in the eyes and promised him I would return when the war was over. I promised I would help him build a better life. The taxi ride through the city was like traveling through time. Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, was nothing like the war-torn place I remembered. Gleaming skyscrapers reached toward the sky where I once saw smoke and helicopters. Modern cars filled streets that used to echo with the sound of military convoys. Young people on motorcycles weaved through traffic, laughing and talking on cell phones, completely unaware of the ghosts that haunted every corner for someone like me. I checked into a small hotel in District 1. Nothing fancy. I've never been comfortable with luxury, especially not here. It felt wrong somehow, like I was flaunting the prosperity I'd built in America, while the people who suffered through this war struggled to rebuild their lives. The hotel clerk, a young man probably born long after the war ended, smiled politely and handed me my key. To him, I was just another American tourist. He had no idea I was carrying 40 years of guilt and regret in my luggage. That first night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound from the street below sent my mind racing back to the jungle. A motorcycle backfiring became gunfire. Voices in the hallway became soldiers calling for backup. I lay in that narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was losing my mind. Maybe I should have stayed in Ohio. Maybe some promises are meant to be broken. But when morning came, I knew I had to try. I had to find Duc's family. I had to know what happened to that brave little boy who risked everything to save an enemy soldier's life. I owed him that much. I owed him everything. The memories came flooding back as I sat in that hotel room planning my search. It was 1971, and I was Sergeant Joe Mitchell, 1st Infantry Division. We were on a routine patrol about 60 miles northwest of Saigon, moving through dense jungle that seemed to swallow sound and light. The humidity was suffocating, and every step felt like walking through a steam bath. We'd been in country for 8 months, and I thought I knew what to expect from Vietnam. I was wrong. The ambush came out of nowhere. One moment we were following a narrow trail through the undergrowth, and the next moment the world exploded in gunfire and screaming. Viet Cong fighters emerged from spider holes and hidden bunkers like ghosts materializing from the earth itself. My squad scattered in all directions as bullets tore through the jungle canopy above our heads. I took shrapnel in my left leg, and a bullet grazed my shoulder. The pain was incredible, but the fear was worse. I stumbled through the jungle for what felt like hours, bleeding and disoriented, until I collapsed beside a small stream. The sounds of battle faded into the distance, replaced by the eerie silence of the deep jungle. I was alone, wounded, and completely lost. That's when I saw the hut. It was small and simple, built on stilts with a thatched roof, almost invisible among the trees. I crawled toward it, hoping to find shelter, maybe some water to clean my wounds. I expected it to be empty. Most of the rural population had fled the fighting in this area, but as I pulled myself up the wooden steps, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. Footsteps. Someone was inside. I drew my sidearm with trembling hands, preparing for another fight. But when the door opened, I found myself staring at a child, a Vietnamese boy, maybe 12 years old, with intelligent eyes and clothes that had been patched and repatched countless times. He looked at me, this bleeding American soldier pointing a gun at him, and instead of running or screaming, he stepped forward and gently pushed my weapon down. "You hurt," he said in careful English. "I help." I should have been suspicious. I should have remembered my training about enemy sympathizers and booby traps. But something in that boy's eyes told me he meant no harm. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was the way he looked at my wounds with genuine concern, but I let him help me into the hut. His name was Duc, and he spoke enough English to communicate basic ideas. His father had worked as a translator for French colonial administrators before the war, and Duc had inherited his gift for languages. Over the next 3 days, as he cleaned my wounds and brought me rice and water, we developed an unlikely friendship. Duc told me his story in fragments, mixing English and Vietnamese, and sometimes just using gestures when words failed. His parents and older brother had been killed 6 months earlier, when American bombs meant for a Viet Cong supply depot had hit their village by mistake. Duc had survived because he was visiting relatives in another province. He'd been living alone in this jungle hut ever since, too afraid to go to the refugee camps and too proud to beg for help. Here was this kid, orphaned by my own country's bombs, and he was risking his life to save an American soldier. It didn't make sense. When I asked him why he was helping me, he thought for a long moment and then said, "War make everyone hurt. Maybe we stop hurting each other. War stop too." Those words hit me harder than any bullet ever could. This 12-year-old boy, who had every reason to hate Americans, was showing me more compassion than I'd seen from anyone in months of combat. He changed my bandages twice a day, brought me herbal medicines his grandmother had taught him to prepare, and even shared his meager food rations with me. We spent hours talking, or trying to talk. I taught him more English words, and he tried to teach me Vietnamese, though I was hopeless at the tones. He drew pictures in the dirt to explain things, and I showed him photographs from home, my parents' farm in Ohio, my girlfriend Sarah, my dog Rex. He was fascinated by snow, which he'd never seen, and I promised to send him pictures of winter when I got back to the States. On the third night, as my wounds were finally starting to heal, Duc woke me with urgent whispers. He'd heard voices in the distance, Vietnamese voices, but not friendly ones. Viet Cong fighters were moving through the area, and they would search every hut. If they found me, they would kill us both. Duc knew a path through the jungle that would take me back toward American lines. It was dangerous. We'd have to move at night and avoid several enemy checkpoints. But it was my only chance. As we prepared to leave, I realized I might never see this remarkable boy again. The war was escalating, and American forces were being rotated out regularly. There was no guarantee I'd ever make it back to this remote corner of Vietnam. That's when I made the promise that would haunt me for the next 40 years. I took Duke's hands in mine and looked into his trusting eyes. "When this war is over," I said, "I'm coming back for you. I'm going to help you get an education, maybe bring you to America. You saved my life, Duke. I won't forget that. I promise I'll come back." He smiled then, the first real smile I'd seen from him since we met. "You promise, Joe? You come back?" "I promise," I said. And I meant it with every fiber of my being. Duc guided me through the jungle for 6 hours that night, moving like a ghost through terrain that would have been impossible for me to navigate alone. He knew every tree, every stream, every safe path through the maze of vegetation. Just before dawn, we reached a clearing where he said American patrols sometimes passed. He pointed toward a distant ridge and told me to follow it east until I found a road. We said goodbye there in that clearing, two unlikely friends separated by war and circumstance. I gave him my watch, a cheap Timex, but it was all I had, and he gave me a small carved wooden elephant that his father had made. I still have that elephant today, sitting on my desk back in Ohio, a constant reminder of a promise I failed to keep. I was rescued by an American patrol the next morning, just as Duc had predicted. They found me stumbling along that ridge, dehydrated and feverish, but alive. Within hours, I was in a field hospital, and within days, I was on a transport back to a base hospital in Da Nang. The doctors said I was lucky. The shrapnel had missed major arteries, and infection hadn't set in thanks to whatever herbal treatments Duc had used on my wounds. But as I recovered, all I could think about was that promise. I wrote letters to military intelligence, trying to get information about the village where I'd met Duc. I asked about refugee programs, about ways to sponsor Vietnamese children for immigration to the United States. Every official I spoke to gave me the same response. It was complicated, dangerous, and probably impossible. The war was escalating, not winding down. Rural areas were becoming more dangerous by the day. Finding one specific child in the chaos would be like looking for a needle in a haystack that was on fire. I was rotated back to the States in early 1972, my tour of duty complete. I promised myself it was temporary. I would finish my service, get my discharge, and then find a way back to Vietnam to find Duc. I would keep my promise, no matter how long it took. But life has a way of derailing even the best intentions. The America I returned to was not the same country I'd left. The war was deeply unpopular, and veterans were not welcomed as heroes. We were reminders of a conflict most Americans wanted to forget. I struggled with what doctors now call PTSD, though back then we just called it adjustment problems. I had nightmares, panic attacks, and a drinking problem that nearly destroyed my life. I tried to research ways to get back to Vietnam, but the war was still raging, and civilian travel was impossible. I wrote letters to the Red Cross, to church organizations, to anyone who might have connections in Southeast Asia. Most never responded. Those who did told me the same thing. Wait until the war ends, then maybe something could be arranged. The war ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon, but instead of opening doors, it slammed them shut. Vietnam was now a communist country, closed to American visitors. The boat people crisis was beginning, with thousands of Vietnamese refugees fleeing their homeland in overcrowded vessels. I watched the news coverage with growing despair, wondering if Duc was among those desperate souls risking everything for freedom, or if he was still somewhere in that jungle, waiting for an American soldier to keep his promise. Years passed. I got married to Sarah, the girl from the photographs I'd shown Duc. We had 2 children, bought a house in suburban Cleveland, and I built a successful career in construction. From the outside, I had achieved the American dream. But inside, I was haunted by the memory of a 12-year-old boy who had saved my life and trusted me to save his in return. I never stopped trying to find information about Duc. As the internet developed in the 1990s, I spent countless hours searching for any trace of his family, his village, anything that might lead me back to him. I contacted Vietnamese American organizations, hoping someone might have connections to help me search. I even learned to use Google Translate to write messages in Vietnamese, posting them on early internet forums and message boards. But Vietnam in the 1970s and 1980s was a closed society, still recovering from decades of war. Records were incomplete or destroyed. Millions of people had been displaced, killed, or had fled the country. Finding one person seemed impossible, but I couldn't let go of the hope that somewhere Duc was still alive, still waiting. The guilt ate at me slowly, like acid. I had built a comfortable life in America, while the boy who saved me had been left behind in a war-torn country. Every success I achieved felt hollow. Every comfortable moment felt unearned. Sarah tried to understand, but how could she? How could anyone who hadn't been there understand the weight of a promise made in a jungle clearing 40 years ago? By 2015, I was retired, my children were grown, and Sarah had passed away from cancer 2 years earlier. I was alone with my memories and my regrets, wondering if I would die, without ever knowing what happened to Duc. That's when everything changed. Vietnam had opened to tourism, and the internet had made the world smaller. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. I spent months planning the trip, researching travel requirements, learning basic Vietnamese phrases, and trying to prepare myself emotionally for what I might find. The rational part of my mind knew that Duc was probably dead. 44 years had passed since we said goodbye in that jungle clearing. He would be 56 now if he had survived the war, the famines, the political upheavals that followed. The odds were not in his favor, but I had to try. I owed him that much. Now, sitting in that hotel room in Ho Chi Minh City, I pulled out a detailed map and tried to identify the area where I'd met Duc. Military maps from the 1970s were different from modern tourist maps, and the landscape had changed dramatically. What had once been jungle was now farmland or suburbs. Villages had grown into towns, and towns had been absorbed into the expanding city. I decided to start at the Ben Thanh market, the heart of the old Saigon. If anyone would remember the old days, it would be the vendors who'd been selling there for decades. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing simple clothes that wouldn't mark me as a wealthy American tourist. I wanted to blend in as much as a 68-year-old white man could blend in anywhere in Vietnam. The market was a sensory overload. Vendors called out in Vietnamese, advertising everything from fresh fruit to silk scarves to motorcycle parts. The smell of fish sauce and grilled meat mixed with incense and diesel fumes. I wandered through the narrow aisles, looking for older vendors who might have been alive during the war years. Most of the conversations went nowhere. My Vietnamese was terrible, and many of the older vendors spoke little English. But I kept trying, showing Duc's photograph to anyone who would look, explaining in broken phrases that I was looking for information about a family from the war years. Some vendors looked at me with suspicion. What was this American really after? Others showed polite interest, but had no useful information. I was about to give up when I met Mrs. Lin at a small stall selling traditional medicines. She was probably in her 60s, with kind eyes and surprisingly good English. When I showed her Duc's photograph and tried to explain my story, she listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions about the location and time frame. Many families scattered after the war, she said gently. Records were lost. People moved to find work or escape memories. But sometimes, if you know where to look, you can find traces. I have a nephew who works with social services. He helps people find lost relatives. Maybe he can help you. Mrs. Lin's nephew was named Min, and he agreed to meet me the next day. He was a social worker in his 40s who had helped reunite families separated by war and economic migration. When I told him Duc's story, he was intrigued but realistic about the challenges. The area you describe was heavily affected by the war, Min explained. Many villages were destroyed or abandoned. People fled to the cities or to refugee camps. But we can try to trace records from the local schools, temples, and government offices. Sometimes families left traces even when they thought they had disappeared completely. We spent the next 3 days traveling to rural areas northwest of the city, visiting villages that might have been near where I met Duc. The landscape was beautiful, but almost unrecognizable from my memories. Rice paddies stretched to the horizon, dotted with modern farmhouses and cell phone towers. It was hard to imagine this peaceful countryside as the war zone I remembered. In the third village we visited, we met an elderly man named Mr. Tran, who had been a teacher during the war years. When I showed him Duc's photograph, his eyes widened with recognition. "I remember this boy," he said in Vietnamese, which Min translated. "He was very smart, very good with languages. His family was killed in a bombing, and he lived alone in the forest for a while. But he came to our village school sometimes, when it was safe. He talked about an American soldier who had been kind to him." My heart was pounding. After all these years, I had found someone who actually remembered Duc. But Mr. Tran's next words hit me like a physical blow. "The boy died in 1977, he said through Min's translation. "There was a fever that swept through the area. Many children died that year. We had no medicine, no doctors. He was buried in the village cemetery." I felt like the ground was falling away beneath my feet. I had come so far, searched for so long, only to learn that Duc had died just 2 years after the war ended. He had been 14 years old, still waiting for an American soldier to keep his promise. The guilt that had driven me across the world suddenly felt crushing, unbearable. But then Mr. Tran said something that changed everything. "He had a younger sister," the old teacher continued. "She survived the fever. A family in the city took her in. I think she might still be alive." The search for Duc's sister took another week of detective work that felt like the most important investigation of my life. Min proved to be invaluable, using his connections in social services and his knowledge of Vietnamese bureaucracy to trace records that would have been impossible for me to access alone. We followed a paper trail through school enrollment records, family registration documents, and temple records that documented births, deaths, and marriages in the rural communities. Her name was Mai, and she had been 8 years old when Duc died. According to the records we found, she had been taken in by distant relatives who moved to Ho Chi Minh City in the early 1980s, part of the massive internal migration as Vietnam began rebuilding after decades of war. The trail led us through several addresses as the family moved from one district to another, always seeking better opportunities in the rapidly changing city. Finally, we found her. Duc Nguyen was now 52 years old, working as a seamstress in a small garment factory in District 10. Min had contacted the factory owner, who confirmed that a woman matching our description had worked there for over 15 years. She was known as a skilled worker and a quiet person who rarely spoke about her past. I spent the entire night before our planned meeting rehearsing what I would say. How do you approach someone and tell them you knew their brother 40 years ago? How do you explain that you've carried guilt about a promise to a dead child for most of your adult life? How do you ask for forgiveness from someone who might not even remember the brother she lost when she was 8 years old? The garment factory was located in a narrow alley lined with similar small businesses. The sound of sewing machines created a constant mechanical rhythm that reminded me of the helicopter rotors from my war days. Workers, mostly women, sat hunched over their machines in the humid air, focused intently on their work. The factory owner, a middle-aged man named Mr. Duc, the irony of the name wasn't lost on me, led us to Mai's workstation. She looked up when we approached, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. The resemblance to her brother was unmistakable. She had the same intelligent eyes, the same delicate bone structure, though her face was lined with the wear of hard work and difficult years. When Mr. Duc explained that we wanted to speak with her about her family, I saw a flash of wariness cross her features. "My family is all dead," she said in Vietnamese, which Min translated. "There is nothing to discuss." I pulled out the photograph of Duc and placed it gently on her workbench. The reaction was immediate and powerful. Her hands flew to her mouth and tears began streaming down her face. She picked up the photograph with trembling fingers, studying every detail as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. And this time she spoke in English, heavily accented but clear. I took a deep breath and began to tell her the story. I explained who I was, how I had met her brother in the jungle, how he had saved my life and nursed me back to health. I told her about the promise I had made and how I had spent 40 years trying to find him. As I spoke, Mai's expression shifted from suspicion to amazement to something that looked like relief. "He talked about you," she said quietly. "After the war ended, when he came back to our village, he would tell stories about the American soldier who was kind to him. He said, 'You promised to come back.' He believed you would keep that promise." The weight of those words was almost unbearable. While I had been building my life in America, Duc had been waiting, believing, trusting in the word of a soldier he had known for 3 days. The guilt I had carried for decades suddenly felt even heavier, but there was something else mixed with it now. A strange sense of validation. My promise had mattered to him. It had given him hope during the darkest years of his short life. Mai agreed to meet with me after work to talk more privately. She suggested a small cafe near her apartment, a place where we could speak without the noise and distractions of the factory. I spent the afternoon walking through the city, trying to process the emotions that were threatening to overwhelm me. I had found Duc's family, but Duc himself was gone. I was 40 years too late to keep my promise to him, but maybe I could still do something meaningful for his sister. The cafe was simple and clean, with plastic chairs and tables that wobbled slightly on the uneven floor. Mai arrived exactly on time, having changed from her work clothes into a simple dress that looked carefully maintained but showed signs of age. She carried a small bag that she clutched tightly in her lap as we ordered tea and tried to figure out where to begin this impossible conversation. "Tell me about Duc," I said. "Tell me what he was like after the war." Mai's face softened as she began to share memories of her brother. Despite the trauma they had both experienced, Duc had tried to maintain his optimism and his faith in human goodness. He had taught himself to read and write more fluently, using books salvaged from destroyed schools. He had helped other orphan children in their village, sharing food when he had it and offering comfort when he didn't. "He was always talking about America," Mai said, with a sad smile. "He would describe the snow you told him about, the big farms, the cars everyone owned. He said someday he would go there and see it for himself. He said his American friend would help him." I had to excuse myself and step outside for a moment to compose myself. The image of Duc holding on to those dreams, believing in a promise that would never be fulfilled, was almost too painful to bear. When I returned to the table, Mai was looking at me with an expression of understanding that surprised me. "You feel guilty," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I admitted. "I should have found a way to come back sooner. I should have tried harder." Mai was quiet for a long moment, stirring her tea thoughtfully. "My brother died believing you would keep your promise," she said finally. "That belief gave him hope during very dark times. Maybe that was the real gift you gave him. Not the promise itself, but the hope it represented." She opened the small bag she'd been carrying and pulled out a bundle wrapped in faded cloth. Inside were several items that made my heart stop. There was my old Timex watch, the one I had given Duc in that jungle clearing. There was the wooden elephant he had given me. Apparently his father had carved 2 of them, and there were several pieces of paper covered with careful handwriting in both Vietnamese and English. He wrote letters to you, Mai explained. He never sent them because he didn't know your address in America, but he wrote them anyway. He wanted to tell you about his life, about our village, about his dreams for the future. With Mai translating the Vietnamese portions, I read those letters with tears streaming down my face. Duc had written about the seasons changing, about helping to rebuild their village, about teaching English to younger children using the words I had taught him. He had written about missing his parents, but finding strength in the memory of kindness shown by an enemy soldier. He had written about his plans for when I returned, places he wanted to show me, foods he wanted me to try, stories he wanted to share. The last letter was dated just a month before he died. In it, he wrote about feeling sick but remaining hopeful that he would recover in time for my return. He wrote about his sister Mai, how smart she was, how he was teaching her English so she could talk to me when I came back. He ended the letter with words that will haunt me forever. I know you will come, Joe. I trust you. American soldiers keep their promises. Mai watched me read these letters with a mixture of sadness and compassion that reminded me so much of her brother. When I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. He forgave you before there was anything to forgive, she said gently. He understood that war makes everything complicated. He never stopped believing in your goodness, even when you stopped believing in it yourself. I told Mai about my life in America, about the success I had achieved and the guilt that had shadowed every accomplishment. I told her about my wife Sarah, who had died 2 years earlier, and how she had encouraged me to make this trip to Vietnam. I told her about my children, who were now adults with families of their own, and how I had never been able to fully explain to them why their father sometimes seemed haunted by memories of a war they had never experienced. What happened to you after Duc died? I asked. Mai's story was one of survival against overwhelming odds. After Duc's death, she had been taken in by relatives who treated her more like a servant than a family member. She had worked from the age of 10, first in rice fields and later in factories as the family moved to the city. She had married young to a man who was kind but struggled with his own war trauma. They had 2 children together, both now teenagers, and they lived in a small apartment that they shared with another family to split the rent. It has not been easy, Mai said with characteristic understatement, but we survived. We found ways to be happy, even when life was hard. Duc taught me that before he died, that happiness is something you create, not something you wait for. I found myself thinking about the contrast between our lives. While I had built wealth and comfort in America, Mai had struggled with poverty and hardship in the country we had both been shaped by, yet there was a dignity and strength in her that I envied. She had faced her challenges without the luxury of guilt or regret. She had simply endured and found ways to create meaning in difficult circumstances. I want to help, I said. I know it's 40 years too late to keep my promise to Duc, but maybe I can do something for his family, for you. Mai's reaction surprised me. Instead of gratitude, I saw a flash of pride and even anger cross her face. I am not a charity case, she said firmly. I have worked for everything I have. I don't need pity from Americans who feel guilty about the war. I realized I had approached this all wrong. This wasn't about my guilt or my need for redemption. This was about honoring Duc's memory and respecting the dignity of his sister. I needed to find a way to help that didn't diminish Mai's pride or reduce her to a victim of circumstances. You're right, I said. I'm sorry. This isn't about charity. This is about family. Duc was my friend, which makes you my friend too. And friends help each other when they can. We talked for another hour, carefully negotiating a way forward that would honor both Duc's memory and Mai's dignity. She told me about her children, her son Lin, who was 17 and dreamed of studying engineering, and her daughter Huang, who was 15 and wanted to become a teacher. Both were excellent students, but the family couldn't afford university tuition. Duc always said education was the most important thing, Mai said. He said knowledge was the one thing no one could take away from you, no matter what happened. I have tried to give my children the education he never had the chance to finish. That's when I knew how I could honor my promise to Duc. Not by rescuing his sister from poverty, but by helping to fulfill his dreams through the next generation. We agreed that I would establish an education fund for Mai's children, and eventually for other children in their community who showed academic promise but lacked financial resources. We'll call it the Duc Nguyen Memorial Scholarship, I suggested. For the first time since we had met, Mai smiled broadly. He would like that, she said. He always wanted to help other children learn. This would make him very happy. The next morning, Mai took me to visit Duc's grave. We traveled by motorbike taxi through the outskirts of Ho Chi Minh City, past rice paddies and small villages that reminded me of the Vietnam I had known during the war. The cemetery was simple and peaceful, surrounded by farmland and shaded by old trees that had somehow survived decades of conflict and development. Duc's grave was marked by a small concrete headstone with his name and dates carved in Vietnamese characters. Mai had brought incense and flowers, following traditions I didn't understand but respected deeply. As she lit the incense and placed the flowers carefully at the base of the headstone, I found myself struggling to find words for a conversation I had imagined having for 40 years. "I'm sorry I'm so late," I whispered, feeling foolish but needing to say the words anyway. "I tried to find you, Duc. I never stopped thinking about you." Mai knelt beside the grave and spoke softly in Vietnamese, and I could tell she was telling her brother about our meeting, about the letters I had read, about the scholarship fund we were planning. The scene was both heartbreaking and healing, a family reunion that was 40 years overdue and would never be complete. As we sat in the shade of those old trees, Mai told me more stories about Duc's final years. Despite the hardships he faced, he had become a teacher of sorts in their village, helping younger children learn to read and write. He had used the English words I taught him to create simple lessons, and he had talked constantly about the importance of education and understanding between different peoples. He said the war happened because people didn't understand each other, Mai explained. He thought if children could learn about other countries, other languages, maybe there would be less fighting in the world. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was a child who had lost everything to war, yet he had chosen to focus on building bridges rather than walls. His vision of education as a path to peace had shaped his short life and was now inspiring the scholarship program we were creating in his memory. We spent the afternoon visiting the village where Duc had taught his informal classes. Many of the older residents remembered him fondly, and several people who were now adults told me how Duc had helped them learn to read. One woman, now in her 50s, showed me a notebook where she had carefully copied English words that Duc had taught her, words I had taught him in that jungle hut 40 years earlier. He said these words came from his American friend, she explained through Mai's translation. He said someday his friend would come back, and we could practice English together. The ripple effects of those 3 days I had spent with Duc were more far-reaching than I had ever imagined. The words I had casually taught a 12-year-old boy had been passed on to other children, creating a small legacy of learning in a remote village. It made me think about all the ways our actions echo through time, touching lives we never know about. Over the following days, Mai introduced me to her family. Her husband, Tan, was a quiet man who worked as a motorcycle mechanic. He had served in the North Vietnamese army during the war, which created an initially awkward dynamic between us. Here we were, two veterans from opposite sides of a brutal conflict, sitting at the same dinner table and trying to find common ground. But Thanh surprised me with his openness and curiosity about my experiences. Through Mai's translation, we shared stories about the war that revealed how similar our experiences had been, despite fighting for different sides. We had both been young men caught up in events beyond our control. We had both lost friends and carried psychological scars. We had both struggled to build meaningful lives in the aftermath of trauma. "War is the same for everyone who fights it," Thanh said during one of our conversations. "It doesn't matter which uniform you wear, everyone goes home changed." Mai's children, Lin and Huong, were initially shy around me, but their curiosity about America and their excellent English skills soon broke down the barriers. Lin peppered me with questions about engineering programs in American universities, while Huang wanted to know about teaching methods and educational philosophy. Their intelligence and ambition reminded me so much of their Uncle Duc that it sometimes took my breath away. I extended my stay in Vietnam by 2 weeks to help establish the scholarship fund properly. Working with Minh and local officials, we created a program that would provide educational support not just for Mai's children, but for other promising students in the community who lacked financial resources. The bureaucracy was complex, but everyone we worked with seemed genuinely excited about the project. The scholarship fund required more than just money. It needed local oversight, application processes, and long-term sustainability. We partnered with a local educational foundation that had experience managing similar programs. They would handle the day-to-day administration while I provided funding and stayed involved in major decisions from America. During this process, I met other American veterans who had returned to Vietnam for various reasons. Some were tourists seeking closure, others were involved in humanitarian projects, and a few were even living permanently in the country they had once fought in. Their stories helped me understand that my journey was part of a larger pattern of reconciliation and healing that had been happening quietly for years. One veteran, a man named Robert who had lost his legs to a landmine in 1970, had been living in Vietnam for 5 years and running a program to provide prosthetic limbs to disabled Vietnamese veterans. Another, a former Navy pilot named Susan, had established a medical clinic in the Mekong Delta. These Americans had found ways to transform their war experiences into positive contributions to the country they had once tried to destroy. "Guilt can eat you alive," Robert told me during one of our conversations, "or you can use it as fuel to do something meaningful. The choice is yours." I also met Vietnamese veterans who had dedicated their post-war lives to reconciliation efforts. They organized exchanges between former enemies, supported humanitarian projects, and worked to preserve the history of the conflict while promoting peace. Their willingness to work with former American soldiers was both humbling and inspiring. One evening, Mai took me to a local temple where the community was holding a ceremony to honor ancestors and pray for peace. I was the only American present, and I felt conspicuous and uncertain about whether I belonged there. But the elderly monk who led the ceremony welcomed me warmly and invited me to participate in lighting incense for the dead. As I stood in that temple, surrounded by people whose lives had been shaped by the same war that had shaped mine, I felt something shift inside me. The guilt that had driven me across the world was still there, but it was no longer the dominant emotion. It was being replaced by something else, a sense of connection, of purpose, of redemption that didn't require forgiveness because it was based on love rather than debt. The ceremony included prayers for all the war dead, Vietnamese and American, military and civilian, those who had died in battle and those who had died from the lingering effects of conflict. In that moment I understood that Duc's death was part of a much larger tragedy. but also that his life and our friendship had been part of something larger too. A human connection that transcended the artificial divisions created by war. After the ceremony, the monk spoke to me through Mai's translation. He said that the dead are honored not through guilt or regret, but through actions that create positive change in the world. He said that my journey to Vietnam and the scholarship fund I was establishing were ways of honoring not just Duc, but all the young people whose potential had been cut short by war. Your friend's spirit lives on in the children who will benefit from his memory, the monk said. This is how we defeat death, by ensuring that love and learning continue. As my extended stay in Vietnam neared its end, I realized that I had found something I hadn't even known I was looking for. I'd come to honor a promise to a dead boy, but I had discovered a living connection to a community and a cause that gave new meaning to my remaining years. The scholarship fund was just the beginning. I could see ways to expand it, to create exchanges between American and Vietnamese students, to build the kind of bridges that Duc had dreamed about. Mai and I spent my last evening in Vietnam planning the future of the scholarship program. We talked about criteria for selecting recipients, about ways to measure success, about how to ensure the program would continue long after I was gone. But mostly, we talked about Duc and how proud he would be to see his sister and his American friend working together to help other children achieve their dreams. He always said that good things come from bad experiences if you're patient enough to wait for them, Mai told me. I think this scholarship is what he was talking about. I gave Mai my contact information and promised to stay in touch regularly. This wasn't going to be another 40-year separation. We were family now, connected by love for a boy who had died too young, but whose spirit continued to inspire positive change in the world. The night before my departure, I couldn't sleep again, but this time it wasn't because of anxiety or guilt. It was because I was excited about the future, about the students who would benefit from the scholarship fund, about the ongoing relationship I would have with Mai's family, about the ways this experience would change how I spent my remaining years. I thought about Sarah, my wife, who had encouraged me to make this trip even though she was dying of cancer at the time. She had understood that I needed to complete this circle, to transform my guilt into something constructive. I wish she could have lived to see how right she had been. I thought about my own children, who had grown up with a father who was physically present but emotionally distant, haunted by experiences he couldn't explain. Now I had a story to tell them that made sense of those haunted years, a story about friendship across enemy lines, about promises kept even when they seemed impossible, about the power of love to transcend the artificial divisions created by war and politics. The morning of the scholarship ceremony arrived with the kind of brilliant sunshine that seemed to bless important occasions. We had organized the event at the local community center in Mai's district, a simple building that served as a gathering place for weddings, festivals, and other significant moments in the neighborhood's life. Word had spread throughout the community about the American veteran who had returned to honor his Vietnamese friend, and the turnout was larger than we had expected. Local officials attended, including the district education director and several school principals. Teachers brought their most promising students, many of whom would be eligible for future scholarships. Mai's extended family came, including elderly relatives who remembered the war years, and younger cousins who saw this as a celebration of educational opportunity. Even some of the vendors from Ben Thanh Market, including Mrs. Lin, who had first helped me in my search, made the journey to witness this moment. I had prepared remarks in both English and Vietnamese, though my pronunciation of Vietnamese was still terrible after weeks of practice. But the effort to speak in their language was appreciated, and the audience was patient with my mistakes. I began by telling Duc's story, how a 12-year-old boy had risked everything to save an enemy soldier, how that act of compassion had changed both our lives, and how his belief in the power of education was now inspiring this scholarship program. Duc Nguyen believed that knowledge was the one thing no one could take away from you, I said, reading carefully from my prepared Vietnamese text. He believed that education could build bridges between people who seemed like enemies. Today, we honor his memory by giving other young people the same opportunities he dreamed of having. Mai spoke next, sharing memories of her brother that brought tears to many eyes in the audience. She talked about how Duc had taught neighborhood children to read and write, how he had shared his meager food with other orphans, and how he had never lost faith in human goodness despite everything he had suffered. She explained that this scholarship wasn't charity, but a continuation of Duc's own teaching mission. My brother believed that every child deserves a chance to learn and grow, Mai said. This scholarship will help children who have the intelligence and determination to succeed, but lack the financial resources to pursue their dreams. It will help them become the teachers, doctors, engineers, and leaders our community needs. The first recipients of the Duc Nguyen Memorial Scholarship were announced that day. Besides Mai's own children, Lin and Huang, we selected 5 other students from the local area who had demonstrated exceptional academic ability despite challenging circumstances. There was Huang, a 15-year-old girl whose father had died in a construction accident and whose mother worked multiple jobs to support 4 children. There was Min, a 17-year-old boy who had been caring for his disabled grandmother while maintaining top grades in his class. Each recipient had a story of resilience and determination that reminded me of Duc himself. As I watched these young people accept their scholarship certificates, I felt a profound sense of completion. This was what Duc had dreamed of. Young Vietnamese students getting the education they needed to build better lives for themselves and their communities. The promise I had made 40 years ago in a jungle clearing was finally being fulfilled, not in the way I had originally imagined, but in a way that honored both Duc's memory and his values. The ceremony concluded with a tree planting ceremony in the small garden behind the community center. We planted a young mango tree that would grow and provide fruit for future generations, just as the scholarship program would provide opportunities for future students. Each scholarship recipient helped shovel soil around the tree's roots, symbolically investing in the future they would help create. After the formal ceremony ended, the celebration continued with a traditional Vietnamese feast prepared by the community. I found myself sitting at a table surrounded by 3 generations of Vietnamese families, sharing stories and laughter in a mixture of English and Vietnamese. The barriers that had once seemed insurmountable, language, culture, the legacy of war, had dissolved into simple human connection. An elderly man named Mr. Hai, who had fought with the Viet Cong during the war, approached me during the meal. Through Mai's translation, he told me that he had been in the area where I met Duc and might have been among the fighters who forced us to flee that night in 1971. Instead of awkwardness or hostility, our conversation was filled with mutual respect and shared understanding of how war had shaped both our lives. We were all young and following orders, he said. Now we are old and can choose to build peace instead of continuing old conflicts. Your friend Duc understood this even as a child. He saw the human being inside the enemy soldier. As the afternoon wore on, I realized that this ceremony was not just about establishing a scholarship fund. It was about healing, reconciliation, and the power of human connection to transcend even the deepest divisions. The young people who received scholarships that day would grow up in a world where former enemies could work together for positive change. They would understand that education and understanding were more powerful than weapons and hatred. May's children, Lin and Huang, presented me with a gift before I left for the airport. It was a photo album they had created documenting my visit to Vietnam and the establishment of the scholarship program. The final page contained a letter they had written in English, thanking me for honoring their uncle's memory and promising to use their education to help others in their community. Uncle Duc would be proud to see how his friendship with you has grown into something that will help many children, Huang wrote. We promise to study hard and to always remember that education is a gift that should be shared with others. The ride to the airport was bittersweet. I was eager to return home and share this experience with my own children, but I was also sad to leave the community that had welcomed me so warmly. Mai accompanied me to the airport, and we spent the final hour before my flight talking about plans for the scholarship program's future. We had established a sustainable funding mechanism that would continue long after my death. We had created partnerships with local schools and educational organizations that would identify deserving students. Most importantly, we had built a network of people committed to Duc's vision of education as a force for peace and understanding. This is not goodbye, Mai said, as we embraced at the departure gate. This is the beginning of a new chapter in our family's story. You are part of our family now, and family stays connected no matter how far apart they live. The flight back to America gave me 12 hours to reflect on everything that had happened during my month in Vietnam. I thought about the guilt that had driven me to make this journey, and how it had been transformed into something more positive and productive. I thought about Duc, who had died believing in a promise that seemed impossible to keep, but whose faith had ultimately been vindicated in ways he never could have imagined. I thought about the ripple effects of kindness and compassion, how a 3-day friendship between enemies had grown into a scholarship program that would affect hundreds of lives over the coming decades. I thought about the power of education to break cycles of poverty and conflict, and about the responsibility we all have to help the next generation build a better world. When I arrived home in Ohio, I immediately called my children to tell them about my trip. For the first time in their lives, I was able to explain the source of the sadness and guilt that had shadowed our family for decades. I told them about Duc, about the promise I had made and finally kept, about their new Vietnamese family members, and about the scholarship program that would be part of their inheritance. My son, David, who was now a successful lawyer with children of his own, was amazed by the story. Dad, I always knew something from the war was bothering you, but I never imagined it was anything like this. I'm so proud of what you've accomplished. My daughter Jennifer, who worked as a teacher, was particularly excited about the educational focus of the scholarship program. This is exactly the kind of project Mom would have loved, she said. She always believed that education could change the world. Over the following months, I stayed in close contact with Mai and the scholarship recipients. I received regular updates on their academic progress, photos from school events, and letters expressing gratitude for the opportunities they had been given. Watching these young people pursue their dreams gave me a sense of purpose and fulfillment that I had never experienced before. The scholarship program grew beyond our initial expectations. Word spread through Vietnamese American communities in the United States, and other veterans began contributing to the fund. We expanded the program to include summer exchanges, where American students could visit Vietnam and Vietnamese students could visit the United States. These exchanges created the kind of cultural understanding that Duc had dreamed about. 3 years after my return from Vietnam, I received news that brought tears to my eyes. Linh, Mai's son, had been accepted to study engineering at Ho Chi Minh City University of Technology, one of the most prestigious technical schools in Vietnam. His acceptance letter mentioned that his scholarship essay about his uncle Duc and the importance of international friendship had impressed the admissions committee. I want to become an engineer so I can help build the infrastructure my country needs, Linh wrote to me, But I also want to build bridges between people, like Uncle Duc taught us to do. Education is the strongest bridge of all. As I write this story, 5 years have passed since my return to Vietnam. The Duc Nguyen Memorial Scholarship has helped over 50 students pursue higher education. Several of the early recipients have graduated and are now working as teachers, nurses, and engineers in their communities. 2 have started their own scholarship programs for disadvantaged children, continuing the cycle of giving that Duc inspired. Mai and I correspond regularly, sharing news about our families and planning for the scholarship program's future. She has become like a sister to me, connected by our shared love for a boy who died too young, but whose spirit continues to inspire positive change in the world. Her children call me Uncle Joe, and I consider them my nephew and niece. The guilt that drove me to Vietnam has been replaced by gratitude. Gratitude for Duc's friendship, for Mai's forgiveness, for the opportunity to transform a wartime tragedy into a force for peace and education. I understand now that some promises take 40 years to fulfill, not because we lack the will to keep them, but because we need time to understand what they really mean. Duc Nguyen saved my life twice. First, he saved it literally in that jungle hut in 1971, nursing my wounds and guiding me to safety. But he saved it again in 2015, when his memory gave me the courage to face my guilt and transform it into something meaningful. His belief in human goodness, his faith in education, and his vision of a world where former enemies could become friends continue to inspire everyone who hears his story. If you've listened to this story, I hope it reminds you that it's never too late to keep a promise, never too late to seek forgiveness, and never too late to transform guilt into positive action. I hope it reminds you that education is indeed the strongest bridge we can build between different peoples and cultures. And I hope it reminds you that sometimes the most important promises are the ones that seem impossible to keep. The Duc Nguyen Memorial Scholarship continues to accept donations and applications. If this story has moved you, I encourage you to support educational opportunities in your own community, or to reach out to organizations working for reconciliation and peace. Like and share this video if you believe in the power of education to change the world. Subscribe to hear more stories about the connections that unite us across all the barriers that seem to divide us. Some promises are worth waiting 40 years to fulfill. Some friendships transcend death itself, and some acts of kindness echo through generations, creating ripples of positive change that continue long after we're gone. That's the legacy Duc Nguyen left behind, and that's the promise I was finally able to keep.